From I Am Interchange, it's the Hatch podcast series. Deep in a forest at Arbor Day Farms, located in Nebraska City, the birthplace of Arbor Day and a site dedicated to celebrating trees and environmental stewardship. Hatch Heartland brought together thought leaders, activists, artists, and disruptors. Over 4 days, we connected, shared challenges, and worked on solutions with the potential for global impact. Imagine a city alive with stories, every corner whispering tales of dreams, struggles, and aspirations. It's a place where communities don't just live, but co-create their surroundings, weaving narratives into the very fabric of their environment. This is the essence of world building, where storytelling becomes a force for transformation, turning visions into tangible realities. Today, we step into that world. I'm your host, Tate Chamberlin, and I'm joined by an incredible lineup of guests: visionary designer and storyteller Alex McDowell, urban innovator Meegan Elliot, systems thinker Mark Beam, artist and storyteller Ash Eliza Smith, and community builder Jenn Stein. Together, we'll explore how world building shapes not only our imagination, but also the spaces we inhabit, and how, through collaboration and imagination, we can craft a future worth imagining. It's Dispatch from the Heartland. Join us, won't you? Welcome, everybody. This is the Hatch podcast series. I'm Tate Chamberlin. We are at Arbor Day Farms in Nebraska City, Nebraska, and we've got an awesome topic today on world building. We've got Alex McDowell, Meegan Elliot, Mark Beam, Ash Smith, and Jenn Stein. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's your relationship to world building?
I was introduced to Alex by David McConville, a common friend, who's also on the board of directors of the Buckminster Fuller Institute with me. And it just immediately struck me as something that allowed communities to reimagine their own communities and to actually let go and play, because I think the future of work is play. If we can find meaning in whatever we're doing, I think that's play. That was my first introduction.
I've trained as a production designer, and production design in film is the most spherical part of filmmaking, in the sense that the camera hasn't yet been pointed, and it's not. As a production designer, you're always building an environment that is going to contain the story in some way or another. And so I always think of it as spherical, because the camera, in the very early stages, you're conceptualizing a world at every stage in a way, whether it's a room or a street corner or a small, whatever you're building. You're building it in a series of stages, a kind of wireframing, until it gets far enough, deep enough, and accessible enough for those people, particularly the director, to step inside it and start making decisions about which direction they're going to point the camera. And even though we didn't call it world building, I'd say, looking back, that it was fundamental to production design from a very early stage in my career. That either the rapidity at which you would have to create worlds in music videos, where there's not even time to work out which way the director's going to point his camera, it's just going to be a free-for-all, to Fight Club, where it was a really intensely, deeply developed world to the finest detail of something that looked like it was a house people just walked into. And then finally Minority Report, which was the full expression, where it was actually defined and named, and it was, you are going to build a world before there's a script. And that's where these conversations grew from. I think that I was just thrown into a place where I had to define what world building was, because it was undefined. There wasn't really any precedent for the position we were put in with Steven Spielberg. It was, films start with scripts, and the scripts are a linear passage. And even if you're defining a series of worlds all the way along that line, you still have a kind of direction set. In Minority Report, it was an entire world, full context. No idea where the camera was going to be, where the actors were going to be, where the story was going to take place. So having defined that, we had to break it back down and say, what have we actually done? What was the process? And that point in 2000 was where we had to start hypothesizing and creating a system and actually retroactively working out what we had done to produce a world so that we could repeat it.
I got into world building, or realized I was doing world building through speculative design. I would create objects, things, services for the future, or that would exist in the future, that were really just about being critical about the present, or thinking about how we could design objects, the world differently. But then if you start with an object or a service and start extending out, you start getting really interested in what everything else is happening around that object. And so it was that speculative design work. And then, interestingly enough, my very early work was working in art departments on film sets. And so I was the one that was either wallpapering or being sent to a prop shop to get something from a specific time period. And so I also had that kind of realization that I'm making this entire environment that may never get seen on the set. Like what I'm doing, spending like 5 hours, like painting this little section of a room that may never be seen on camera, but how there was so much power in that, and the detail and the specificness of that world that we're creating that I loved.
Just jumping in on that, because I think we get to the obsessive point in design and art department that we actually put things inside of drawers that we know are never going to be opened, because you're imbuing the world with a sense of its reality. And so there may be an opportunity for the actor to open the drawer, and there's that kind of safety aspect, but it is a kind of forming a relationship with environment and story. And so we're embedding ourselves in the narrative in a way that is, obsessive and completely unnecessary. But it's, I think, much more pertinent to what we do now, because the finest level of detail, the most granular level of detail is where we end up. That's the center of the mandala. So I think it's a really good point.
And also, just to tag on to that, it's also with so much immersive theater and theater operating without a proscenium, I think that all of these kinds of skills and attention to detail are so important in terms of immersing the audience into a world.
I had a similar path to Ash, where I started in speculative design and design fiction, really thinking about objects, but in an academic setting in a research lab where we were generally developing products, artifacts on a 7 to 10 year horizon. But for clients like Steelcase, who were really thinking about workspace futures in 7 to 10 years. So we were designing these spaces and objects to tell stories about what could be. And I think it was at the time a bit of the reverse of world building. We were starting with this sort of interface or this space and seeing the sort of ethical, environmental, economic implications that came out of these kinds of spaces or objects that we would build. And I moved from that into world building with Alex, starting to think more about that holistic world and then the objects that would be in the world, that this sort of the container. So I started from the small, moving out, and now looking at the bigger picture and moving inward.
Yeah, my journey, I guess, was through knowing what Alex's work was, and then but a real interest in transmedia and helping bring digital media ideas and whole worlds to market. So by building a world and then being able to take out certain narratives which could fit across different platforms to tell an entire story, which was the whole way that media was moving away from linear cable television. And so that was really my interest. And then working with media companies all around the world, but particularly in Asia, to furnish their stories into worlds. So it wasn't just a tool of Hollywood.
In fact, when Meegan and I met was in those events, in those conference events, because I think we were both really frustrated with the idea that a single medium was being promoted in any one of these silos. I came out of film and then met a friend, Habib Zagapur, who came out of game and was working, or out of visual effects actually, and then working in game, and told me about this thing called a game engine. And I realized that for 10 years, I had been laboring with these ridiculously unwieldy tools where a game engine was just sitting there in another silo and absolutely no cross-referencing or exchanging of tools or exchanging of knowledge. And so I think we both started conferences. You started X Media Lab before we did, but the 5D conference, that was the whole point, was that you bring all of this media together and you have the opportunity to develop new tools which are going to tell new kinds of stories in new kind of context. And that segued and wove together with world building perfectly. So I think it was like 2007 we kickstarted what we were doing. And when we first met, that was 7 years after Minority Report. We honed the framework for what world building was and what the system could be and needed to be. But we were just tapping into the tools that would exploit it.
We started in film. It sounds like you all started in the film industry, but we're at Hatch right now, and there's a world building lab and studio happening right now. And so there's this transition from Hollywood to the real world. What's that been like as it transitioned for you? And why did you decide to move it into the real world from Hollywood?
It was definitely a very specific decision for me. And it was kickstarted like most of the things in my career by accident, which was I was asked to co-teach a class at USC just as one of the films I'd worked on finished. And so I, without having any idea what that meant and never having any expectation to move into academia, I did this class with a friend of ours, Scott Fisher, and it was essentially a world-building class with the game students in a space of halfway between cinema and game, and it was very appropriate for developing a kind of new dialogue and new language for students. And kind of opened my eyes, I guess, if I'm thinking back, partly being frustrated with film becoming repetitive in my process and seeing the opportunity of working with people who were incredibly open-minded, who were interested in developing new stories and in fact, very cross-media. We have a good friend who's working in experimental now, Patrick Meegan, whose thesis project or his final project was a theater play. He was a game maker, and he strapped 6 cameras to his head and shot the first probably full 360 VR experience. So he was just actually the first real art scientist that I ever worked with. And that kind of work coming out of the students was really driving the energy for me. And then the other thing was realizing that the power we had, the audience that we could capture with the tools we have in entertainment media, if you just shifted the gaze and applied it to real world issues, the opportunity to use storytelling for change just became more and more obvious.
I didn't start in the film world. I started in finance, and I was a bond trader on Wall Street and became very skilled, I would say, at pattern recognition, looking at really complex environments and then interpreting lots of information into a decision to buy or sell a security or to recommend somebody buy or sell a security. So I came from a very different place, but at the same time, that attention to the whole of looking at chaos and trying to make sense of it at whatever scale that's part of what really, I was always trying to find a way to visualize it, what I was seeing. It was all in my head. Yeah, world building answered a lot of.
So you found patterns in the chaos, and that kind of helped pave the way for your pursuit in it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ultimately, all of us are systems thinkers, right? And that's what we do, whether those systems are within the story of a film or whether they're in finance or what I'm now doing, which is education. And what I learned from world building was that it really was a way to bring new and alternate futures into being. And so now that I had the privilege to be the founding director of the Johnny Carson Centre for Emerging Media Arts, of course, it must be foundational to all that our students will be learning and making. So then I found the fabulous Ash Smith to come on as a professor to ensure that we taught it and that students could learn these tools. And I think media, Manuel Delanda said, media is an industry building industry. We're part of every industry. So these tools fit across all disciplines. We're not a discipline unto ourselves. We're part of everything.
Yeah, we like to say that we're media agnostic in the sense that people can create in game engines, in film, in design objects for a company. So really it can go in any different direction. But I'll also just tack on to that why did we move? I have worked on Hollywood films. I was living in Los Angeles when I came to Nebraska to work with Meegan. And I think that like much of the world, we know that there are more stories to be told. And so really thinking about where we can tell those stories from. And it's just been a real privilege to be able to be located in Nebraska and think about all the kinds of stories and the nuances of stories and the details of different kinds of stories that can be told from different places in the world. So I will say that's also a part of that shift, I think, from Hollywood.
And I think here at Hatch, with the sort of labs that we're doing here, the Kalakas, it's an opportunity to fully immerse people who don't do this every day necessarily into a story world and to build that story world and to actually have a voice and agency in the futures that they want to see. So we're like actively storytelling and building this world in a short amount of time, but everybody is immersed for 5 hours during this time together to really have a voice in the sort of futures that they see, and trying to be aspirational, but also deal with the like really hard topics that you have to think about in the future.
A lot of what we're being asked to do is, and I think to Ash's point, is for people who don't have a voice ordinarily. And I think that extends from the corporations we work with who are not familiar with the idea of storytelling at all, and are not even expecting to be put into the role of storytelling, but much more importantly to those places and people like in Nebraska or like with the indigenous people in Alaska that we're working with, or the people of Wales that Jenn spent a long time working with, who have never been given a voice and yet have such powerful stories to tell. And when you are placed in that environment, and I think the work you're doing in Nebraska is really important in this way, is that suddenly there is an opening up because the problems are so clear, or the need for storytelling is so clear in those places and with those people who have either been overlooked or haven't been given the context for telling stories more broadly, or are very experienced at telling stories like the indigenous people, but it's a kind of internal space because they've been marginalized. World building recontextualizes that, and it by default gives a voice because the imagination is what kickstarts any of the worlds that we build. And the imagination is tapping in story terms is in a way the way that you can frame the notion of you have an imagination is you tell a story, you've tapped into the idea that you have an imagination and that your imagination is power and that your story is a way of transmitting ideas. And then that connects back into the media and how are you going to tell those stories? I think that what we're doing and what Jenn and Ash are running here and driving the world building workshops, or what we call Kalakas, which we can talk about a little bit, what's happening here is opening up the possibility or training people in a way to how to tell stories to take on from this point into their own practice.
You've mentioned Kalakas, and I love the barn raising definition of it. So yes, I'd love to explore the process of that. And then like the hard topics within it on decision making, we talked a little bit about people finding permission to be creative. So it's like, where do we start with this in its simplest form to get people on board?
Jenn, we were talking a little bit earlier about the street corner.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. The way in.
Yeah. So we structured this to the mandala, which is a sort of holistic system, starting with a really global perspective through a number of lenses like economy and resources, infrastructure, governance, and starting with a higher level global perspective on all of these ecosystems, and then drilling down into the street corner and then finally the story level. So we're asking people to imagine a street corner someplace that they can really understand and stand in a future state and think about all of the implications of being in that street corner, sometimes through another character lens, but really using the sort of global perspective to drill down into a local perspective and get people really immersed in this thing that they understand called the street corner, and then develop out these stories from that point of view.
And I would just say that you mentioned this, one of the first things being, think about a street corner from either recent, past, or maybe even when you were 4 years old, and thinking about how bringing that to life through you can write it down, you can just tell us, and then sharing that with one another in that moment. So much comes out, so much creativity, right? Remembering colors and sounds and textures and feelings from perhaps a table of strangers. And so from that moment, people are connecting and drawing from a place of creativity, which is the wellspring of our memory that we will use later when we go back to the future.
We found this to be incredibly powerful. We run a colloquy at the Berlin Film Festival, the Berlinale, with a group of young filmmakers. And almost just as an ice-breaking exercise, we started with this idea, step into a street corner of your memory. But what we've discovered, and we do it with every colloquy now, is that it's an incredibly powerful way of people understanding that they're storytellers, because they get a minute to think about a memory and 2 minutes to tell it. Spontaneity of the moment. They take themselves back into that space. As Ash and Jenn are saying, they're placing themselves in that world. In no time at all, they've been able to picture smell, taste, color, the people they were with, their emotional space, their emotional sense at the time. And what we say to them is, you've just told a story that no one else in the world, in history, will ever be able to tell. You're the only person who could tell that story. And you've taken us all into that story space. You've allowed us to enter your imagination. You've just built a world in no time at all. Now use that muscle memory. And when we build this world, take us back into that world and stand on that street corner in the future, present, and use exactly the same muscles to tell us a story in a future that you've imagined. Because that memory is as fictional as the future that we're building, really. We've created it out of a myriad of different memories to capture that moment. But it's become just such a good way of telling people that they're all storytellers.
Where does world building end and what comes next?
We should probably talk about the mandala quickly, just as a practice. We talked about the kalaka, which is the sort of metaphor for the need for a large group of people, a disparate group of people to come together in this metaphor of barn raising. But as Meegan was saying, we're all systems designers, and at least 50% of our work is building and building on systems that do not allow this kind of very disruptive, potentially chaotic setup that every world build is. The systems are designed to keep us on track in a way, and to frame what we're actually here to do, to focus on. We've developed over the past 20 years this system called the mandala, and what it is really is a circle. It's just, there is a holistic world. Every world we build is contained by the constraints of the questions being asked. So it's not just everything in the world. Every world is very focused, but it's contained by context. Where are we? When are we? What is the provocation that's going to drive the stories forward or drive the discussions forward? The outer circle of the mandala is that context. The mandala is divided up into usually 6 different segments, which we'd call ecosystems, which are looking at ecology, economy, governance, infrastructure, culture, and resources. And generally, that ecosystem contains most of the questions that are going to be asked about a world. But when you place questions in that circle and you place the answers to the questions in that circle, you're automatically forced to understand that wherever you place it, because you place it in relation to those points in the ecosystem, that they all connect to one another. You can't talk about the economy without talking about governance, without talking about... On top of that, we add a sort of target series of circle defined scale. because the context of the world changes dramatically as you change scale. So we start with the global view in a metaphor, let's say a city, and then using that same metaphor, the district, and the context between the district and the city are different, although they're absolutely connected, of course, geographically and socially and politically in every way. And then going down to the street corner, which we've spoken about a lot, which is the most valuable space to explore because you can contain it in your mind. You can gather a group around the idea of a street corner and you understand what that means. And you can stand there in that street corner and imagine all of the moving parts. And it's extremely complex. You can talk about all the way inside the apartment building into the bedroom, into the food on the table in a street corner, and the street and the mobility system and the school and the factory and the shop and all of the things that could be in close proximity. And so that becomes a vertical of that city space and it becomes a microcosm. And if you have the time and the resources, you put more and more of those verticals into that larger holistic city space. And every vertical, every street corner you put in has radically different sets of conditions. Ultimately, they all contain people. And this is the center of the circle is what are the stories? And we keep saying story, but that's because story is the relationship between people and their environment and time and space. If we look and drill down into that center, first of all, it's the people in the street corner, in the district, in the city, but also it's multiple people. And there's, in a broad sense, in the West, we've forgotten that we all coexist, that we actually in a street corner, all of those stories are valid always at the same time. There is no dominant story until you point a lens at that story and follow it. So if we do that over and over again with multiple different people, either in reality, you can certainly follow present stories, but mostly we're asking people to project into the future. So those inhabitants of that center are fictional, which means that you can associate them with specific issues and specific areas of questioning. So if you want to know about education, you follow the 9-year-old girl from her home and having breakfast and stepping out the door and how she got to school and who she's taught by and who her friends are, and then what is her economic status and what is her social status and what does she want out of life. And every person you follow can tell an enormous story and contextualize the world. And then you can follow her grandfather who had recently lost his wife and no longer has somebody to help him with his disability, and he has to negotiate getting out of the front door and onto the transportation system and across the town to his daughter who he never speaks to because he doesn't like her kids. And there's no end to the number of stories that you can tell or the scope that you can get from following those pathways through this very developed and designed world context. So every decision you're making as you pass them through the world is either informed by something you've already learned or is making a demand on the world to know more about the world because you can't tell the story without knowing it. So if you follow the disability example, Jenn spent a lot of time with a group in Wales who were entirely focused on different aspects of, it's good to talk about that particular project because they brought up so many different kinds of questions.
Yeah, we worked with a group called Disability Arts Cymru in Wales, and it was a deaf, disabled, and neurodiverse group of participants, and it was across Wales. It was the one sort of colloquy we did, which was virtual, so that a number of people could participate more easily. But yeah, when you dig into a specific lens like disability within the world, a lot of things that the other groups might not have thought of come up. And it also had, because there are so many different generations involved as well, you have these different ways of approaching solutions too. But one of the big ones that came up was the idea of a wheelchair that you could bring to the beach, because we had a group from Cardiff and from Swansea, and they were thinking about accessibility to the beach. And there were a number of different artifacts that were developed within this world too, to get somebody to the beach, like a wheelchair with giant beach wheels, or the sort of funicular line down to the beach. A lot of the younger people were thinking about AR interfaces for both universal translation, but also sign language to multiple languages. And we set up these constraints for the world to think about and then put these other constraints on within the group too. But some of the innovations that came through talking about each other's needs or the needs that aren't met in the world and then pushing that into the future was a really good discussion, and one of the more innovative sort of groups like of building out this world was this sort of the things that they needed in that world that otherwise might not have come up in one of our sessions.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think that it's a kind of bottom-up design process that's happening, and innovation. Lots of innovation, lots of different ways that a product or a service or technology could be developed. I think that's one of the things that I find the current world build in the Panhandle of Nebraska. Some of the innovations coming from the SUD community are things that either we can look for ways of getting funding for some of the ideas being offered up, or think about policy, or we could also think about the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, different kinds of labs working to bring some of those things to life. So that there's also this other kind of extension that can come out of from the world build.
It identifies the real problems that need to be solved, right? Whereas so much of the Western capital tech world right now is, here's a solution, find me a problem. And I think that's one of the fundamental things about it, because you're identifying the real problems that can be solved and solving them to bring better futures into being. It's pretty straightforward, really.
Why isn't everyone using world building?
That's the point, isn't it?
Yes.
But when you hear a story like Alex, when you were talking about that person, it's just, especially if you're in an intimate setting around a table having these discussions and you hear that story, there's an empathy that arises that transcends this bipolar amygdala of the brain that wants us to either flight, stay or go. And I think it almost is an empathy engine, you know.
Yeah, it's a combination of a provocation engine and an empathy engine. I think that's great because you build this is an entertainment media practice, is that empathy is crucial to everything we do because we're trying to bring people into some form of narrative, whether it's a film, a game, a theater, a piece of architecture, that they're not familiar with. And so you have to use a bunch of tricks to say, you are now able to inhabit this world, you're now able to enter the world, and that's what camera does and what the interface and the UI and all of those finely tuned tools that allow people to enter a world is always to do with empathy. It's like, how do you let people in? And I think a lot of our work is make the world accessible because we've listened carefully to those people who need to inhabit that future, who that future is for, and then using the skills that we have in developing the platforms and the media tools and in this media agnostic, platform agnostic viewpoint we take, which is that a different story may need a completely different way of delivering that story. We are always focused on that ultimate aim, which is whatever we build, it has to carry people along with it, and it has to make it absolutely clear that by entering the world, you can change the world.
I want to go back to your part of your provocation about then what? Okay, then you've done a world build, and then what? And I think all of us are feeling the tensions of our existing systems failing us. And yet there's a fear in change and in evolving new systems or adopting new systems. And at the same time, you have a financial system that's completely siloed and almost impossible to have that same sort of mandala effect of looking at the whole and seeing how everything's interconnected when your financial system that's going to support the actual creation of that vision or realization of that vision, where you have to do a song and dance in 20 to 40 to 50 different ways for each different funder to be able to convey the importance. And I think we're in a liminal moment now to be able to make this much more visible as a practice that leads to the exchange of resources to these communities.
It's a lot of why I think world building is being so widely adopted now, or why we're able to move into very conservative corporations and say world building is useful here, is because the world's so disrupted, because people don't have any answers. They can't rely on a practice or a system that they may have used 4 years ago before the pandemic. Suddenly, everyone in the world, from the smallest child to the oldest person in the world, understands what disruption means now. And they understand that we cannot rely on anything that we want new lenses on it, at least. It's not like the past has disappeared, but we don't necessarily have the tools to deal with the present anymore. And I think that there's a couple of... I worked with somebody who worked with the UN. This was something that came out of one of our Berlin workshops. And he was responsible for one of the really big refugee camps on behalf of the UN. And the UN put this grid down of container housing, basically, for a very large population, over 100,000 refugees. And he watched this happen, and he became more and more dismayed and frustrated that this isn't how people live. And what he was analyzing and looking into was the average length of people spend in that refugee camps is more than 20 years. And they were being put in this kind of temporary housing. And his question was, why is a refugee camp not the basis of a new city? Why are you not designing a refugee camp to actually be capable of becoming a city, as any city would have done in history, where a population gathers? And the problem is there was no focus on that actually as an outcome. The focus was on how do we house people quickly and temporarily, with no view to the future. That particular refugee camp, which he became the mayor of in the end, and he left the UN ultimately in frustration, pulled itself apart, like in a very creative way. The police brought in the materials for building a new police station, and while they went to lunch, the inhabitants of the refugee camp pulled all the materials away and took them and rebuilt housing in another part of town. And then they pulled out the center and they created what is now called the Champs-Élysées, where they were ultimately the most economically viable stores in the country. And people would come to the refugee camp to buy and rent wedding dresses and things like that. Entrepreneurs had set up in the Champs-Élysées in this refugee camp. And there was this sense that you're just not taking hold of the real problem. If there's apart from all of the other problems that we're dealing with, distribution of population and the massive migration of refugees, whether it's climate or war, is a tension we can see changing entire political systems. And yet no one's thinking about the very basic thing of how do people live. And if you want to build a new city, you've got to gather a completely new kind of expertise around that. You've got to be able to put waste management next to education, next to 3 different political leaders, next to urban infrastructure. All of those things have to be able to talk to each other, and there's not a common platform for that. And I think, in my mind, that's actually the driver of everything we're doing, is how do we how do we learn and create the tools to create a new city from the ground up? Takes on every single aspect of every world we've ever built, feeds into that one problem.
There's all these details, and in big projects, I've felt project creep and scope as you keep digging, and in order to do this, you have to do that. In order to do that, you have to do something else. Do you have any examples of how far this has crept, and maybe if it had led to an unintended consequence that you finally learned about?
Every single world we've ever built has led to an unintended consequence. I think that's a success for sure, if we get to places that we never expected to go. I think, if I understand your question, I think there's 2 parts to that from my point of view. One is this idea of systems design, which is a very carefully curated system that allows the reality of very intricate narratives that take us places we can't possibly expect because of the tension between 3 or 4 people around a particular question. Or we did an event at USC 2016, with 200 people in a room who had to create stories in 4 hours, and created 1,000 stories in 4 hours, and then built 200 artifacts in the next 4 hours. And we had no idea where that was going to go, and led to a development of a fictional island that ran for about 1.5 years colleges around the world, just continuing to explore the possibilities of where that might take us. But so I think the intention is an unintended consequence, but it's the creep part, I think, is more the pressure test the world and force you to reevaluate different aspects of the world because they have to contain the tensions of that particular narrative, but it's still contained within a system so that it remains focused on the larger scope, the larger contextual scope of why are we here and what are we actually trying to change.
The creep I'd like to see is the creep into the resource side, where the resources are actually either put up front or known that they're going to exist afterwards. And I think that's the trust that's missing right now in bridging the trust that you need to have with a community that allows you in to be able to let them tell their intimate stories, to the trust of an investor or a series of investors that need to come together for a 30 to 40 to 50 year time frame to do this kind of work. And I think we're at a moment where we can do that. There is a system that allows us to do that. And it's in our heads right now, but I think that's why we want to do this project in the heartland, is to make that visible in Missouri language, in the show me state. We want to show how this actually works in 2 pilot projects, one in the Panhandle of Nebraska with me and the Johnny Carson Center, and with us in Kansas City on the ground, but around that create the scaffolding and the kind of the observatory for investors, partners, and others to be able to see how this works so that it can be shared.
That notion of trust is such a huge part of the work we're doing, because we come in as these outsiders the fact we're coming to the table saying we know nothing is by default we're the least engaged in the center of the problem in terms of history or knowledge. And establishing trust, which goes hand in hand with listening, which is you are the expert, we're here to learn from you, is so essential to these projects being successful. When we have worked with the indigenous tribes, and in particular in Alaska, there's enormous mistrust of the West. We're coming in as this Western group saying we know how to do this. And it's a delicate negotiation, but it does come down to this is a partnership. Ultimately, you, the people who are telling the stories, are the ones driving the outcome. And we're here to facilitate and actually teach the tools that it takes to come to an outcome. And I think that's without establishing that, and I think it's a big part of what we're trying to teach, is how to learn the tools of making trust and making relationships. It's another part of storytelling. It's another part of entertainment media in a way that you have to hand over the work you've done, and you have no idea how people are going to enter that world that you've built. And its success depends on establishing the relationship with the audience, if you like. But trust is really core. I don't think we talk about that enough.
Who's resisting you?
The people with the most money.
There's a conservatism built into the financial system that fears change, I think. It's disruptive, but it needs to be. But I think with the processes that we're talking about, there's a safety that comes with methodology. And I think the other bit that we didn't talk about much was that this is a living thing. It's a living infrastructure. It doesn't stop just because you finish one world build. It's an ongoing, you need to be doing this all the time. And that's why it's so great that Meegan and Ash are in the center of the country teaching this to so many more students, and like you are on the West Coast. And it is spreading widely. We have many practitioners within the Guild of Future Architects that Sharon Chang started, and that we've been carrying on with the 200 members that are having the hard conversations. But back to the co-creation part, we're experimenting with co-leadership. We moved from an organization to an organism model, and from an executive director to a regenerative leadership team. And now are going to start experimenting with cooperative funding. And I think One person that actually I met on this conference, Jeff Yost, who is breaking ground on letting the Nebraska Community Foundation create a pool of unrestricted resources that can be deployed by under the direction of the communities. And I think in parallel with that we need those unrestricted resources. It's not a new concept. It's R&D money, basically. Mm-hmm. DARPA, or you can point to lots of examples. But I think you're right. That's the tension, is people there's an ego attached to giving away money or investing money.
And it's the conservatism, as you say, because there is the reason that money's there is because it's been pulled in the safest possible way to the center. But it's so clear from our perspective when we're working with corporations, for example, how valuable it would be to have the kind of perspective if they embraced some of the work that we're doing, that because we are looking at strategy, we do a lot of work with corporations, and if we do a 30-year future looking at a disruptive set of conditions, like working with a car company who is asking us to investigate a future where they don't make cars anymore, where you can really challenge strategic decisions in the present, that's incredibly valuable and actually very efficient within that corporate scale. But you have to break this point where we do a lot of work with the innovation divisions or the design divisions or in specific departments or sectors of a corporate structure. But what we know is it's fundamental to what we do is that it's supposed to slice through all of those different divisions. That's when it becomes valuable. It's this transition of knowledge between divisions. We work with a corporation where we were given access to a large range of their C-level people, stuff. And it turned out that the 70 people that we interviewed had no idea what each other did. And so you have huge dysfunctionality in traditional corporate structures that world building is actually very good at engaging. It's a system that we can take on, that idea of complexity into comprehension, which is underlying the trust and getting work done and moving it forward. We have to find the language to break through this. And I think Jeff Yost is doing that, is revolutionary in the way that he's taking that language that the corporations understand completely and then turning it into a different way of creating change and getting work done.
I would also say that there's another resistance around many people not believing the function of fiction and understanding that fiction can and does shape reality. And so I encounter many people who are doing methodologies of community participatory design or other kinds of community engagement, but think that what we're doing in terms of story, or don't fully grasp what we're doing. And so think, oh, this is just play. This is just fiction. This is just how is this like pragmatic? They scoff it off. So I meet a lot of resistance around that. And I think hopefully in this podcast, we've proven to you that like story changes the world and that the fiction has so much function. Futures has so many strengths to be able to come together around something.
Whose reality do you think will rule the future?
There's that saying, is the future already colonized? Which when I first started doing futures work, which was in San Diego on the border and going back and forth between Tijuana and UCSD, this came up a lot. Who has the privilege to think about the future?
And that's exactly what we're saying. We all have the privilege to think about it. That's why we do the street corner, because we drop people into the imagination. There's the apocryphal story of Douglas Copeland asking Stanley Kubrick, what will rocket ships look like in 50 years' time? And Stanley says, the way we design them today, because that's what people can imagine. Yeah. But that's the centrality of world building, to ensure that we're not just walking blindly into an already colonized future, we're inventing it.
So in all these decisions, would you rather have the slow pace of democracy or be a dictator for a day?
Slow is good, yeah. I think nothing's going to be interesting unless it evolves, unless you allow that time to evolve and allow the time for breaking the colonizing of the future. So, yeah, definitely time is the most valuable thing.
I'm not going to be able to remember which indigenous leader has said this, but the times are urgent. We must slow down.
Nice.
We could also look to Australia.
As one must.
I lived in China. I have a thing for fast decisions. But in Australia in 1971, we finally got Gough Whitlam in, and I'm not the student of Australian history as other people are, but he came in and he divided the ministry up between himself and the Deputy Prime Minister, and they introduced the Australia Council, and they started land rights and sovereignty for Indigenous people, and they did all of this over a weekend. And it was great. Free education, ending the Australian in the Vietnam War, and they did it within democracy over a weekend. So you can have fast and slow, at least down under.
At least down under.
In the upside down land.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that they both can exist. I also think we're talking a lot about deep time and slow time, and thinking, also think understanding and being able to visualize how many hundreds of thousands of years this planet and beyond go backwards and will go forwards in some kind of capacity. And so being able to think on that scale too, I think requires much more slower. In moving to Nebraska, I have been schooled on slowing down and learning to look at a prairie, because prairies are subtle and have so many, it's not knock you over the head awe that necessarily that you're getting in very mountainous or beach regions, but there's something there that is a thunderstorm rolling in on a prairie, or even just the small bugs and grasses or the different kinds of grasses. And I'm learning that myself. And I don't know, there's a metaphor there. I can't exactly make it, but thinking about the slowness.
What brings you hope?
Old people. And I say that in a weird way, elders. People older than me, because I think oftentimes people like to really go to children of their future and they are. But I also think we have so much to learn. I am constantly blown away by how people that really inspire me that are older or my elders, and thinking about all the amazing things that they're doing and how much knowledge. And yeah.
We saw something amazing in working again with the Indigenous tribes, where the cultural history is about the elders and the children sitting at the feet of the elders. And in a way, speaking to both those, the child and the elder, is that we saw in real time this shift of the elders to realize that they couldn't just tap into the past, that they had to, in order to be able to focus on the future, they actually had to sit at the feet of the children. And it was amazing to see where you would expect the kind of notion of elder being tied to conservatism. They were innovative and took so much risk to just say, hold on a minute, we're not getting all the knowledge we need. And our children are learning faster and they know more about the world, and we need to tap into them. And the balance of that was amazing to see. And in a way, that speaks to the fast slow, actually, because they know more than anyone about how to develop a slow and very powerful culture of protection and evolution. But they're also seeing how quickly things are moving, and you have to be able to react quickly. But I think the other part is this adaptation evolution, which is you may make a fast decision, but you've got to be ready to change your mind really quickly when you see the implication of the decision.
Jen, you want me to go? Because I put myself in the middle of chaos in as many places as I can, I have lots of conversations with lots of people, and I will tell you that every single issue that we're addressing is being worked on by somebody right now all over the world. And what's missing is the scaffolding or the infrastructure to tie those individual projects together. And I think that gives me great hope.
I just feel the old Marxist in me saying hope is not a strategy.
It's not a strategy.
But what enables me to continue, I think enough is, I would agree with absolutely everything that's been said at this wonderful table, and obviously probably something that keeps all of us, and that's art and cultural creation and music and poetry and all those good things.
And joy. It's just, if we can, it just naturally exudes through this process and this dialogue that we have is just a joy that comes with it, and we need that.
Yeah.
Maybe joy is a strategy.
Yeah, I think so. I think
well,
so.
humor,
Yes.
Yeah.
because there's a certain cynicism in there too.
I'm hopeful because we get to do what we do and actually talk to people and interface with them and get to hear all of these different perspectives. And you get so caught up in doom scrolling or looking at social media, trying as little as possible. And that's very hopeless to me. But getting to talk to people through this process all the time and hearing like that we have differences of opinions but we're like usually rational human beings who are compassionate and really care for each other, and being able to really talk to people through this process gives me a lot of hope.
Mark, Ash, Meegan, Jenn, Alex, this is the World Building Kalaka at the Hatch Summit in Nebraska City, Nebraska. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Imagine a future born from shared stories, where every voice has helped shape a world that's more inclusive, vibrant, and resilient. The journey we've taken today shows us that storytelling isn't just about entertainment. It's a catalyst for real-world change and a bridge connecting diverse perspectives and a spark for collective action. The worlds we build with our words and ideas are the seeds of tomorrow's reality. Remember, each of us holds the power to imagine, co-create, and transform. So, keep dreaming big, stay curious, and continue to shape the future with stories you tell and the worlds you help create. Music for Dispatch from the Heartland is by Gangsta Grass, an electrifying blend of bluegrass and hip-hop that captures the spirit of the Heartland. Stay tuned. Later in this series, we'll delve deeper into Gangsta Grass's story and their unique sound in our full episode. Don't miss it.
Son, rebel no pauses, taking out your forces with a switchblade and a rusty gun. Doing this forever, you've just begun. Don't start none, it won't be none.
It seems now more than ever that we have found ourselves on the cusp of monumental worldwide change. Whether we consider the environment, politics, infrastructure, health, economics, or inequities across a broad swath of social constructs, the consensus is clear and urgent. All is not as it should be. The United Nations, a consortium of 193 member states from around the globe, agrees. In 2015, the UN unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. These goals call for urgent action and global partnership to secure peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future.
In alignment with the SDGs, Hatch, a curated network of artists, activists, and entrepreneurs working together to accelerate positive global change, has partnered with I Am Interchange to fuse adventure journalism with experiential design labs to develop innovative solutions to complex global challenges. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe or leave us a rating. This episode was produced by Yara Craner, Susan Karstensen, and me, Tate Chamberlin. A shout out to our media and production team, Jessica Byerly, Darko Sevilla, Jacob Desch, Sean Mackinson, Amin Yarsu, and Zane Giordano. A special thanks to Yara Craner, Jared Silverman, Pete Strom, Eitan Shapira, Rachel Hicks, Roshi Gavechi, Anya Bulis, Tania Sanders, Erica Mackey, Raymond Unsodagi, Mark Gerner, Elke Govertson, Ignacio Packer, Kyle McGrew, Eskil Björkestrand, Joshua Lesser, and the rest of the Hatch team and crew from Co-Palace for hosting me. Thank you. With so much gratitude to the Hatch supporters, Steelcase, the Kauffman Foundation, the Gwydion Fund, Envision Equality, the Hatch Volunteers, Board of Directors, Hatch Guardians, and the community who help make this work and mission possible. To learn more about Hatch, visit hatchexperience.org. Building community could not happen without food. And with that, I'd like to thank Whistle Pig Korean, Red Tractor Pizza, and Zocalo Coffee House. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Shoot me an email at tate@iaminterchange.org. That's tate@iaminterchange.org. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.